I think our head of the intelligence community, Jim Clapper, has acknowledged that I think they underestimated what had been taking place in Syria.
Everybody was surprised to see the rapid advance that ISIL was able to make.
He's blaming now the intelligence community, and by the way, there's already enormous blowback from the intelligence community saying, of course, you know, the president gets a daily intelligence piece of paper, and if a lot of presidents would have a person come over and personally brief them every day, but maybe he doesn't read those because it was clear to all of us.
A lot of reaction to what the president said on 60 Minutes about the surprise, he said, for the intelligence community, saying Jim Clapper has essentially fallen on his sword about the intel. However, there's pushback now from the intel community, as you heard from Senator McCain. This is a quote from then DIA Director General Flynn, and he's testifying in February. Says this: AQI, ISIL, probably will attempt to take territory in Iraq and Syria to exhibit its strength in 2014, as demonstrated recently in Ramadi and Fallujah, and the group's ability to concurrently maintain multiple safe havens in Syria. This is public testimony in Congress. There's also private testimony about the strength of that group. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard, Nina Easton, columnist for Fortune magazine, and Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Okay, Chuck, what about the president's statement and the reaction today?
Well, you know, this was not an intelligence failure. To me, an intelligence failure is an event that, like Pearl Harbor, you didn't anticipate and you couldn't, that you should have. These events in Iraq and Syria were fully anticipated, and indeed in real time there were lots of warnings from within the administration itself about how serious the situation was getting. What happened here instead was that the realities on the ground in Iraq did not square with the president's pre-existing plan, which was to get out of Iraq and stay out. And I think he resisted over many months information that was sort of contrary to that pre-existing plan. And for him now to go back and say the things he said to Steve Croft, I think just digs the hole he's in a little bit deeper. I think what he needs to do is own the miscalculation, own up to it, et cetera, and move on and lead the country through this next crisis. Admittedly, that's hard to do in an election time where the other side is bashing him in campaign ads and so forth. But the more he owns this mistake, I think the better off he's going to be.
But there wasn't a lot of owning it last night, Nina. In fact, I mean, it was not we, it was they.
It was they. And, you know, as General Flynn was saying, I mean, it's amazing how with such clarity that General Flynn, and then Director of Defense Intelligence, said at the time, he not only predicted that they would have this land grab, ISIS would make a land grab by 2014, he said the biggest problem would be how the Sunni tribes behave, and it would also be how Iraq's military withstood this. So he called it blow by blow. That was public testimony. There were people in the media, including on this panel, talking about the clear and present danger of ISIS going back, I would say, a year now. I mean, that's something to keep in mind. It's been on the media radar screen for that long. So how can you say that they didn't call it? By the way, also Clapper's comments, if you put them in context, what he said was we underestimated whether the Iraq military would stand up. But he did not say that we underestimated the prowess of ISIS.
I want to play this other semantics issue that the administration has about what is this group, Khorasan, in Syria.
In January, President Obama refers to the Islamic State as a JV team. Days later, the Armed Services Committee holds a hearing on new global threats. Senator Kay Hagan, absent. In fact, Hagan's missed half the Armed Services Committee hearings this year. While ISIS grew, Obama kept waiting, and Kay Hagan kept quiet.
So, is the Khorasan group part of Al Qaeda?
Well, they're affiliated with, so I wouldn't characterize it that way. There's a range of ways that we characterize terrorist organizations, and obviously we wouldn't have gone after this group if we didn't feel there was a threat that they posed.
So you say affiliate, but would you say they are part of the group?
Well, I think we've characterized it a range of ways.
The definitions are all really nonsense. This is just Al Qaeda. The guys who lead the Khorasan group, as they describe it, are all senior Al Qaeda leaders who have pedigrees that go back years, if not decades. In some cases, these are guys who were planning terrorist operations for Al Qaeda immediately after 9/11 and in the years after 9/11.
Well, that first soundbite was an ad in North Carolina, something we want to talk about in a little bit about this issue in the race. But that, Steve, was pretty remarkable what the State Department said at the briefing, Jen Psaki. They came out just before the show with a clarification. Quote, "This Khorasan group is a term sometimes used to refer to a network of al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda core violent extremists who share a history of training operatives, facilitating fighters and money, and planning attacks against the U.S. and Western targets," saying that they basically have decades of experience.
Yeah, well, Jen Psaki obviously had absolutely no idea what she was talking about, which has been the case, frankly, with this administration on these issues going back some 6 years. You know, it's important to point out that Nina talking about Michael Flynn, the former head of the DIA, giving testimony that was predictive and that assessed the threat accurately, he's no longer in his job. He was pushed out of his job. He left his job a year early, and at least in part because of the aggressive analyses that the DIA was providing the administration. And it's worse than the president just shifting the blame to the intelligence community. The president and some of his top intelligence officials, John Brennan and Jim Clapper in particular, pushed back on people who were saying, no, Mr. President, this is a growing threat. Al-Qaeda is expanding. It's not decimated the way that you said. One of those officials is Mike Flynn. He no longer has a job.
So is it your contention that this is all about this message, that core Al-Qaeda was decimated, and keeping true to that message that the administration and the president have been talking about since before the election?
Since the spring of 2012. I mean, you can go back and actually mark the speeches. You know, John Brennan gives a speech before he's nominated as CIA director in April of 2012, in which he says, in effect, Al-Qaeda died with Osama bin Laden. He said, well, the affiliates might pose some dangers down the road, but this is a threat that's going away. The president made the same argument. All of the administration and the campaign, importantly, made that argument consistently for 6 months, from May 2012 to November of 2012, and they've continued to make it ever since. They didn't let reality intrude on their arguments, and this is what the DIA had been saying repeatedly for years. And the final point, remember, the document cache that we extracted from the bin Laden raid, which was May of 2011, more than 1 million documents. The public has seen 17 of those documents. Of the 1 million documents, we've fully exploited and analyzed 10% of that cache. If we want to know what Al-Qaeda's up to, if we want to know about how the organization is evolving, we certainly ought to make it a top priority to look at those documents.
You buy this, Chuck, that this compartmentalizing the threat to all these different groups and names takes away the overall umbrella that this is radical Islamic extremists trying to kill Westerners?
What I do buy is that the president's been quite open about the fact that he's finished fighting wars. He said in his State of the Union address, we need to come off our permanent war footing. And so I think it's quite in keeping with that they're going to, propound a narrative that's consistent with the policy that he has chosen. The problem is that once that narrative was no longer applicable back in February when they took Fallujah, that is, ISIS took Fallujah, they didn't react, they didn't change course, and that's, I think, part of why
just a quick note on the timeline. February, that was the same time frame of the DIA comments. That was the same time frame of the JV comments by the president. Came right before that. Yep.
Next up, Israel's